by June of 1942, Japan had been waging its aggressive war of expansion into the South Pacific for approximately half a year, and in this time frame between two battles, they had lost half of their aircraft carrier strength. Due to these massive losses, on the 20th and 21st of June 1942, conferences took place aboard the battleship Yamato, where discussions were held regarding the future of the Japanese Navy's operations and construction programs. This would result in the Wartime Warship Urgent Program, which included the Urgent Carrier Replenishment Program. Document 8107 was submitted to the Naval Ministry and approved on the 30th of June 1942. Some notable events that took place as a result of this document's approval was the approval of the mass production G-16 aircraft carrier, the conversion of the battleship Shinano into an aircraft carrier, and, for the topic of this video, the conversion of two in-service battleships, Ise and Hyuga, into partial aircraft carriers. The conversion of the Ise-class battleships into hybrid carrier battleships was without a doubt the most unusual project to occur on a capital ship during the Second World War. But if we look at the time frame and the background surrounding this conversion, it becomes more understandable and even expected. For Japan in specific, the mid to late 1920s was when they had begun to take an interest in aircraft carrier development. This was primarily as a result of the Washington Naval Treaty canceling their capital ship projects. However, they had also taken an interest in the hybrid concept, and in the early 1930s they would develop designs G6 and G8, with G8 actually beginning construction, but it was cancelled as a result of the Tomozuru incident in March of 1934. That project would be replaced by G9, which would go on to be the Soru. Through the remainder of the 1930s, Japan would solely dedicate itself to aircraft carrier projects, not hybrids, and as a result, they became the world's leader in aircraft carrier design and production by the time the Pacific War began in December of 1941. This is where problems for Japan's battleships began to develop, as the attacks on Pearl Harbor and Force Z would eliminate the battle line threat of the United States and Great Britain in the Pacific Ocean, and while Japan was still dedicated to its own battle line, they now had a secondary role to the aircraft carrier. With time, the aircraft carrier force would continue to cause chaos in the South Pacific and Indian Oceans, and by early June of 1942, they had moved to the mid-Pacific, where they would attack Midway, but in return, 4 aircraft carriers were sunk in a single fight. The numerical advantage the Japanese enjoyed at the beginning of the war was now gone, as they were more or less on equal terms with the United States at this point, and, given time, the Japanese knew that the United States would begin to mass-produce aircraft-carrying vessels, and so the Japanese realized they needed projects that were quick, cheap, and used minimal resources. Aside from the projects I had mentioned at the beginning of the video, the conversion of Japan's in-service battleships, excluding the Yamatos, was seriously considered, and projects regarding the Kongos, Fusos, Iseis, and Nagatos were all drawn up. While the full extent of these projects is not completely known, we do know that they had considered full-blown conversions, half conversions, and quarter conversions. To specify the difference between those three, the full conversion would be the complete removal of all upper workings and armament of the battleships and a full-length flight deck being installed, similar to what had occurred with Shinano. A half conversion would be the aft half of the ship effectively up to the forward superstructure, receiving a flight deck and hangar, and the quarter conversion is what would eventually be accepted for the Ise and Hyuga. It was quickly recognized that a full-blown conversion of any of these capital ships would take too many resources, take too much time, and be too expensive. So expensive, in fact, it would be cheaper to build a brand new carrier from the keel up. The half conversion was also deemed too expensive for the eventual payoff, and as a result, the Japanese Navy decided to go with the cheapest option. But the question of deciding which ships would receive the cheapest conversion was difficult, as all of these ships were valued in the battle line. However, they had to choose. The Kongos were considered fast and excellent carrier escorts because of their speed, so they were not selected for the conversion. The Nagatos were considered too powerful for such a conversion, as their 16-inch guns could be decisive in a battle. This left the 14-inch carrying battleships of the Fuso and Ise classes. It was decided that both Fusos and Ises would receive this partial conversion, but due to the high quantity of projects Japanese yards were involved in at this time frame, they could only begin with 2 of the conversions, and after they were completed, the next 2 could begin. This leads us to a significant question in the story. Why did the Japanese select the Ises for the conversion first, rather than the older and less efficient Fusos? In reality, there were 2 primary reasons driving this decision. The first one has to do with Hyuga, as at 4 p.m. on the 5th of May 1942, while undergoing gunnery exercises, there was an explosion in turret number 5. What's interesting about this explosion is that externally, it was reported that there were no real signs of an explosion having occurred, with the exception of smoke exiting the turret. There was no visible flame, none of the turret plates were ejected, and the gun that suffered the explosion remained at elevation. It was quickly reported to the bridge that an explosion occurred in the gunhouse of turret 5, and there was a small fire. To prevent that fire from causing a magazine explosion, the bridge ordered that both magazines 5 and 6 be flooded. Fuso would escort Hyuga back to the Kure Naval Yard, and once there, an examination of the damage would be conducted, and the Navy would opt not to repair the turret. Instead, turret number 5 was completely removed from the ship. Its barbette was covered over by a steel plate, and on top of that, 3 triple-mount Type 96 25mm anti-aircraft guns would be installed. So, the first benefit of selecting the Ises first for the conversion was the fact that the Hyuga had already begun the process, as one of its turrets was already removed. For the second reason, this will apply to both ships, as when they were constructed, the elevation of the main battery turrets was 20 degrees. In the early 1920s, this was increased to 30 degrees, and during their full-blown modernizations in the mid-1930s, it would be increased to 43 degrees. The way the Japanese achieved this increase in elevation was a bit unusual. Rather than raising the trunnions, they simply deepened the gunwales. But the whole structure aft was not very deep, and as a result, turret number 6 could not have its trunnions deepened to allow the 43-degree elevation. As a result, it was stuck at 30 degrees maximum. This meant that in a long-range engagement, the number 6 turret on both Ise and Hyuga would be useless, as the guns would be unable to elevate high enough to engage a target, and since Hyuga had already lost its number 5 turret due to the explosion, the firepower of these ships was significantly reduced to be on par with that of the Kongo class. This ultimately means that in comparison to the Fusos, even though the Ises are an overall more efficient design, they were less effective at long-range engagements than the Fusos, and so the loss of the aft 2 turrets was completely acceptable. That brings us to the conversion itself. We've established that the after pair of turrets was greatly deficient, but did replacing them with an aircraft hangar improve the ship's battle worth? In my opinion, no. When looking at the conversion specifically from a design standpoint, there are a couple of positives. The first one is the fact that the after magazines were easily converted to operate aircraft. The number 5 magazine would hold the bombs, a total of 44 500kg and 22 250kg bombs, which was enough for 3 attack runs. The number 6 magazine would be converted into the avgas tank, which would contain enough fuel for 3 attack runs as well. The second and final positive to this conversion I will mention in the video is the fact that the after superstructure was easily expanded and converted to handle the operations of the aircraft so that the forward pagoda could continue operations for the gunnery platform. Now it's time to get into the negatives of the conversion. The most obvious issue was the lack of space. The hangar had a total length of 40 meters, and at its forward end its width was 28 meters, and it would taper down to 11 meters at its after end. On top of the hangar was the so-called flight deck. This had an overall length of 70 meters and a maximum width of 29 meters, but calling it a flight deck is a bit of a stretch, as the aircraft would neither take off or land on it. The space issue was significant in terms of how many aircraft the hangar could contain, as at maximum it could only hold 9 aircraft, and since this conversion project was supposed to be replacing numbers lost in fleet carriers, 9 aircraft was pathetic. As a result, the Japanese decided that the flight deck would also have to house aircraft. In total, it could contain 11, and to bolster this number even further, each of the 2 catapults would also have an aircraft mounted on them at all times. In total, each battleship could contain 22 aircraft, and as a combined force, this would be 44. But there was another issue, as having 11 aircraft sitting on the flight deck could cause congestion, and if one of the aircraft were to fail, it could block the entire operation of the battleship. So, an extensive system of rails along with 12 turntables were installed to allow the rotation of aircraft if necessary. As I mentioned, aircraft were unable to launch or land on this flight deck. As a result, 2 catapults were installed, one on port and one on starboard at the forward end of the flight deck. There were significant issues with this system, as the Japanese had never managed to develop a catapult that could be integrated into a flight deck. They had the concept back when developing the Hiru in the 1930s, but the project never got anywhere. Ultimately, the 25-meter Type 1 No. 2 Model 11 catapult was selected for installation, and in order to help speed up the process of loading aircraft onto the catapult, they were aligned with the rails on the flight deck, and they were also placed at the level of the flight deck, so it was not necessary for a crane to pick the aircraft up and place it on the catapult, as was common on Japanese warships. While the method of installation of these catapults would ease air operations, it complicated the gunnery aspect of the ship, as the original issue with the No. 6 turret at long-range engagements would now be transferred to the No. 3 and 4 turrets, as the catapults would severely restrict their arcs of fire, and in the case of the No. 4 turret, would restrict the elevation at which those guns could achieve. Another issue with the conversion was how to get the aircraft from the hangar to the flight deck. The Japanese decided to install a single T-shape elevator in the middle of the flight deck. This T-shape would allow the aircraft to fit through the well, but would minimize the amount of space the elevator needed to operate. The issue with this elevator system wraps back around to the congestion issue on the flight deck, as only one aircraft could be raised from the hangar at a time, which meant that hangar was congested, and if there are already aircraft on the flight deck, it would be difficult to remove all 9 aircraft from the hangar to prepare them for spotting and launching. This meant that in practice, it would be impossible for these battleships to ever launch a full strike of 22 aircraft. The final issue I wish to discuss in this video is the fact that removing the No. 5 and 6 turrets, along with their barbettes, accounted for nearly 4,000 tons of the ship's overall displacement. This meant that once the new hangar and flight deck were installed, the ship was very forward-heavy, and this would mess up the hydrodynamics of the hull, slowing the ship down, and it would also make gunnery difficult. To compensate for this issue, it was decided to pour 8 inches of concrete onto the top of the flight deck, and concrete was also added around the steering gear mechanisms to weigh down the rear of the ship and rebalance the weights. While the concrete did provide a degree of protection, the off-balance nature of the ship was never permanently solved, and the Japanese would have to compensate by trimming the ballast tanks. By the time the conversion of these battleships into hybrids was completed at the end of 1943, and training was concluded by mid-1944, the war situation had deteriorated even further to the point where these ships would never receive a full complement of 22 aircraft, along with air personnel, and their only operations were as decoys. Since the situation had gotten so bad, the Japanese decided to cancel the conversions of the Fuso and Yamashiro, and the Ise and Hyuga would be the most unique battleships in history, as they were the only ones to be hybrids. It can ultimately be judged that the conversion of these battleships into hybrids was not worth undertaking, not because they had failed to achieve anything during the conflict, as Japan's battleship force sat idly by anyway, but because it took up finances and resources the Japanese probably should have diverted to the G-16 project. The great irony of this project is the fact that after the ships were used at the Battle of Leyte Gulf as decoys in Admiral Ozawa's Northern Force, the catapults were removed in order to restore the firing arcs and elevation of the No. 3 and 4 turrets to make them more suitable gunnery platforms. The Japanese had lost complete faith in the conversion they had just completed. With that having been said, I have nothing more I wish to add on to this topic for today. So, if you have learned something new in this video, why not leave a like and a comment down below? And have a wonderful day.